Hey everyone, welcome to my second of two videos on the Canon F-1N. This video we're going to cover how to do everything with this camera. The last video looked at just the buttons and what they are. Now we'll talk about how to use them. First thing we're going to do is talk about mounting and unmounting lenses. This has an FD mount. There are two different types of FD mount lenses. There are these silver ones here where the ring physically turns, and then there are ones that have a black ring with a little button here, and on those the lens turns. So the general process is the same. With the silver ones you put it in and then you turn the ring. With the black ones you would put it in and then turn the whole lens. So we're going to see how to do that. With either type of lens you want to take the dot on the lens and line it up with the dot at the top of the camera. Once you've done that with an FDN lens, the all black ones, you just turn it. With the older silver ring lenses, you turn the silver ring. And now your lens is mounted on the camera and it's ready to be used. To unmount it, you do the opposite. With the newer all black FDN lenses, you push the button that's right around there on them, hold it down and turn it and release it. With the silver mount lenses, there's no button to push, you just turn it until the two dots align again, or you can't turn it any further, and then remove it. And that is how you mount and unmount lenses on the Canon F-1N. Let's take a look at how to load film and use this camera and the film in this camera. First thing we're going to do is pop the back open. Now we have access to the back. I'm going to try to keep the camera from falling over here. There we go. We'll take our roll of 35mm film. What we're going to do is drop it into this, oops, we need to make sure that this bit is up. I'm going to drop the film into that little chamber, and we're going to pull out the leader and feed it into the take-up spool like that. Next, we'll advance the film. There we go. If you have it in automatic mode, when you advance the film, it will do an automatic exposure. So if your lens cap is on, you're in for a very long exposure. And then basically you'd advance it until it takes up. I've over advanced it, you don't have to go 3 shots. Then once you've advanced it, you close this. Next thing you're going to do is advance the film using the shutter button in this until you get to the S. This should be 3, I want 1 extra. It's two frames on this camera. Now you've got it to the S. And then you want to tighten up any slack in this. That helps to make sure that the film stays flat as it progresses through the camera. Jesus, there we go. Okay, got it. This camera has a cam or some other device in it so that it only rewinds when this lever is flipped out. If that lever is not flipped out, it doesn't rewind. It doesn't engage the film. So when we talked about in the previous video, there's an issue with the shutter advancing and advancing and advancing. You need to flip this lever out and hold on to it while you advance it through that issue. So let me show you what's happening inside the camera as you take pictures. If you were using this for real, you would go through all of your pictures and then you would rewind the film entirely and then you would open up the camera back. If you open up the camera back while the film is in there, it will ruin the film. Film is one and done, so you don't want to ruin it. But I do want to show you what's going on in here. So when you take a picture, here's the film tension sprocket, and it's going to rotate along with the take-up spool. There we go. You can see it rotating it. These little guys right here would normally press down right here to hold the film over this so that these sprockets line up with the holes. You can see here how it lays in between these uppermost channels and then how it's flat against these inner channels which line up with the sprocket holes so that any scratching that happens from these inner guide rails rather is done on the sprocket holes, not on the film surface. And this pin right here that we talked about prevents the film from going down and misaligning vertically. So lots of stuff in here to keep the film moving well. Now let's say you've gone through your whole roll of film and you're ready to rewind it. If you just try to rewind it, it's not going to get very far because of this guy. So you push the film rewind button and that causes this sprocket now to turn freely and you just rewind it. One thing to notice about the film is that as it comes in here, it it gets wound in the same direction as it's wound into here. Most cameras will wind it opposite so that it's emulsion side out instead of film back side out. So typically it's only professional cameras that rewind the film so that the back side is out, not the emulsion side. Now, in the real world, you would rewind this all the way, but I want to reuse this film again. Then you would, after it's rewound all the way, lift this, pop the back open, and take out the film and put in your next roll if you were going to continue shooting. So that's how the film works in the camera and moving through it. Next thing we're going to talk about is changing the battery. The battery is kept under here. All you need to do is put your finger on the button on the bottom side of this grip, take that out, and then you can remove the battery and put a new one in. PX28s have red as the standard for the positive terminal. Typically they're blue or black on the negative, but red is the standard for the positive. So all you have to do is put it with the positive or red side up. There we go. Because these are ones that can go in either way. If you really wanted to work it in, you could put it in upside down, but you shouldn't. Some people will tell you to store your camera with the battery upside down when you're not using it to preserve the battery's lifespan. Just take the battery out. If you leave it in there for long enough and you forget it for a few years, it could leak. I have still seen batteries come out that are upside down completely dead, so I would imagine that circuits are still somewhat draining them. Even static discharge can drain them over time. If you're really that concerned about your battery life, just take it out, store it in a little plastic bag in your camera case. So there we go. You put the new battery in that way. This guy lines up with this one little pin right here, fitting into the camera body, and then you just put it into place. And these silver gizmos right here have a little lip on them. They have this little cutout on them, and that's the part that the holes there, you can see, lock into. So that's the locking mechanism. So if for some reason the spring on your back here, I've never seen it happen, but if in theory the spring were shot, then this wouldn't hold on very well because the locking mechanism is reliant on the spring and the clips hooking into those little silver posts. So let's say that you wanted to do some flash photography. This camera has interchangeable prisms, but at least this one has a hot shoe. Some of them do not. If you have a hot shoe on your prism, you can plug a flash right into here and use it on your camera. If you don't, or if you want to use off-camera flash, which realistically you should, off-camera flash will always give you better results. Then you would just plug your flash cable into the PC port right here, and you could either have a flash grip coming off the bottom of the camera or just hold the flash in your hand. And those are the two ways to use a flash, through the PC port or through the hot shoe. On this camera, your flash setting is the lightning bolt, and that's not lined up correctly. So there you can see on the side of the prism is a little white indicator of what your shutter speed is. And you want to line it up with the lightning bolt if you're going to use flash photography. And that will make sure that the flash sync speed is correct. So here's how a flash works. Let's say that my hands represent the shutter curtain, okay? They're gonna go over to the side here. When you take a picture, the first one opens and then the second one follows, just like that. So with a flash, the first one opens, and now for a very brief moment, the entire image plane is exposed to light. The curtains are off to the side. And then when the exposure stops, the curtain comes back and closes. If you're at a shutter speed faster than your shutter sync, let's say you're at 1/250th, it would be like this. So the curtains aren't physically moving any faster, but the opening between them gets smaller. 1/2000th of a second might look like that, okay? So let's say that you trip your flash at 1/2000th of a shutter. Curtains would be going along, and then at some point in the process, your flash would go off, and then the only part of the image that would be illuminated would be that gap between your shutter curtains. let's say you do a 1 second exposure. Your first curtain opens, your camera curtains stay open for a full second, and then the second one closes. So when it says your sync speed is 1/90th of a second, what that means is it's 1/90th of a second and slower. Any speed slower than a 90th of a second, a 60th, a 30th, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, any of those will work to trigger a flash with this camera. It's not just the one flash sync speed. The next thing that we're going to do is talk about the different metering modes in this camera. So let's take the prism off of it. All right, so now we can see the viewfinder focusing screen. That's a little bit easier to see even. To take it out, if you have fingernails, just work it out that way, pop it out. So here is the entire focusing screen in its housing, okay? This is the way that it goes in. The silver part goes towards the back of the camera, all right? So if you look on the front of the housing here, there we go. You can see that it says Canon F-1N, Japan, so that's just an identifier. And then it says AE. So AE does not mean automatic exposure. E, the second letter, is the focusing screen type. So E in this camera is that standard split prism. The A is what's going to tell you how your camera will meter with this prism installed. So there are 3 different types of metering modes for the Canon F-1N. If it says A at the front, then it's going to use center-weighted metering. So here's what center-weighted metering means. Let's say that what you're looking at right now is the frame that you're going to take a picture of, all right? Center-weighted means that the central area, an area about like this, is going to provide the majority. I believe most Canons, it's 75% of the metering data with center-weighted metering comes from an area about like this circle. Then the balance of the frame will provide the balance, typically I think it's about 25% in Canons, of the metering data. So if you have something super dark in the middle of your frame, it's going to give you a slower shutter speed as it tries to make this dark area light, but it will still be informed by what else is out here. That differs from the other metering modes. So you can see here the focusing screen very clearly showing the AE. If instead of the A, your focusing screen has a P in it, what that means is that you're using a focusing screen that does semi-spot metering. Okay, so what's semi-spot? Spot metering we'll talk about last, but semi-spot is basically the central 12% of the frame, which is an area about like this, probably actually pretty close to the size of this lens hood. And what semi-spot means is that 100% of the metering data comes from that central 12% of the frame. It's called semi-spot because if your prism has an S in the front of it, it's full spot metering. Now what full spot metering means is that the central 3% of the frame, an area about the size of this circle, provides 100% of the metering data. So there are benefits and drawbacks to that. Let's say that what's at the center of your frame is a mid-tone red, and you're using spot metering. 100% of your metering data will come from that mid-tone red, and because it's pretty much mid-tone, it'll be correct. Ooh, but let's go over here. What happens if 100% of your metering data is coming from something black? Well, your camera wants to make this black color gray, wants to make it mid-tone. So this will be gray. Everything else will be very bright. When 100% of your metering data comes from this central spot, what's going to happen is that your camera will always try to make this central spot gray. And if it's not gray, then it's going to skew the rest of the exposure. Spot metering is very good for portraits, as an example, because it will make sure that the image is exposed so that the person's skin tone is the middle range, which will make shadows and highlights look accurate regardless of what the person's actual skin tone is. With semi-spot metering, an area about the size of this mount ring would provide 100% of the metering data. So if you have something like this where you have a mid-tone red and then a dark shadow and then a bright highlight, it's again going to be pretty accurate. But what happens if now your semi-spot, which is a larger area, is all black? Same exact thing as we just talked about. With the semi-spot, it's just a larger spot metering area, which gives you a little bit more flexibility with your spot metering than with a standard and traditional spot meter. If you use spot metering well, it's the most powerful type of metering for your camera. But if you use it incorrectly, it's a really good way to screw up the exposure in your images, especially with automatic exposure. Spot metering is really good if you're using manual metering. So for instance, let's say you're adjusting the shutter dial to whatever speed you want. Find the spot in your frame that you want to have be the middle tone. It could be this shade over here, it could be this dark shadow here. Whatever you want to have as your middle tone, you take your meter reading off of it and then you adjust your manual shutter speed to that meter reading. And then you recompose your image and take your photo. If this right here, which is a pretty middle tone, is your middle tone meter reading, everything else is going to look good. If this dark shadow up here is what you took your middle tone reading off of, this will be gray. Everything else will be very bright. In fact, these areas of chrome will be so bright that they will just be completely white. So what spot metering allows you to do is decide what specific tone you want to have be the middle tone of your image, take that reading and then recompose. All right, while we're talking about metering modes, let's talk about this dial right here. This controls how your camera's light meter behaves. It doesn't alter the mode. In normal, when you push down the shutter button halfway, the meter kicks on. In hold, when you push it down halfway, it kicks on and then it stays on for 16 seconds. In light, you push it down, it operates like it does in hold, but a light comes on behind the meter. So you can see it in the dark. It's a dim red light, but you can still see it. So that is what this dial is for. With normal, when you release the shutter button, the meter then turns off. I tend to like hold or light because I like having the meter stay on for a moment or two after I push the shutter button. Let's talk about exposure value compensation right here. This is going to be most useful when you're in automatic exposure mode. To do that, to get into automatic exposure mode, you need a light meter with that capability. You need to rotate the shutter dial this whole way until you can't rotate it anymore. Then lift up on the outer ring, move it in that last stop, and release. There's a little pin underneath. Let's see if we can get that in focus. There's a little pin right there that connects from the shutter dial to the metering prism. I'll show you what happens when you turn this dial all the way, if I can. The pin goes in, and then you might be able to see it connecting with a little piece under the prism. When it pushes that piece in, that tells the camera to use automatic exposure metering. If that pin is not connected and pushing that in, the camera is not going to work in automatic mode. And I mention that because your exposure value adjuster is going to be very important for automatic metering if you want to control your exposure a little bit. When you have the green one lined up with that line right there, it's going to be great. If you are using a lens at f/5.6 and your automatic exposure says 1/125th of a second, there you go, 1/125th of a second. In automatic mode, you can control that reading, or that shutter speed rather, by adjusting this dial. So I've adjusted it to 1/2. Is that, yeah, that's got it, that's 1/2. So I've adjusted it to 1/2, which means 1/2 of the light. So instead of 1/125th, it would then shoot at 1/250th. All right, so what if we go all the way to 1/4? It would instead shoot at 1/500th. And there are two stops in between each of these 1/4 and 1/2, which are actually their third stops. 1/2 is a full stop difference from 1, and 1/4 is a 2-stop difference from 1. And those two little dots in between the numbers indicate that you can adjust your exposure value compensation by third stop increments. So if you're at 1/125th and 1, and you went one little dot, that would be 1/60th. If you went two little dots, it would be 1/80th, or no, 1/200th rather. And then 1/2 is 1/250th. Let's go in the other way. If you set it to 2, we know that 1/2 is 1/250th, 1 is 1/125th, then 2 must be twice as much light, which would be 1/60th. If you set it to 4, which would be 4 times as much light, then that must be 1/30th. 1/60th is twice as much light as 1/125th. 1/30th is twice as much light as 1/60th, which makes it 4 times as much light as 1/125th. So in automatic mode, this is very easy to use to control your exposure up to 2 stops in either direction. If you're shooting manual, you just adjust it on the shutter speed dial, and that's the way to go. I don't think this works in full manual mode, but I know that if I'm wrong on that, somebody will tell me. And that's okay. If I'm wrong, you guys should correct me. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at how to take a meter reading, how to read the meter with this camera, so that you can understand what you're seeing with the meter. When you look through the viewfinder, this is a representation of what you'll see. The gray area represents the focusing screen and displays the standard focusing screen. Now there are 2 informational displays along the bottom and along the right side. Only one of those will display at a time if your camera is working properly. Along the bottom will display when your camera is in aperture priority mode only, meaning that your shutter control dial is set to A, you have the aperture priority capable prism on your camera, and you're setting the aperture ring on your camera manually. When you're doing that, the display along the bottom will show, and it's triggered when you put the shutter speed dial into A. That part along the bottom displays. In the wide, what's currently blank, rectangle is a list of every shutter speed from 1 second up to a 2,000th of a second. And the red areas indicate your camera is, the required shutter speed rather is too slow on the left side or too fast on the right. I think, might have that switched. Anyway, one side's too slow, one side's too fast. So if the needle is in the red zone, it means that your camera either can't have a shutter speed fast enough for the light, or that it's beyond 1 second. To the right of that long window is it's marked by a black box, but it's your aperture display. So when you're looking through your viewfinder, if you look in that display, you'll see a number like 5.6, 1.4, 8, whatever it is. That's the aperture that your camera is set to. You will have the ability to see your aperture and your shutter speed. So you can then figure out if you need to adjust your aperture to have a proper shutter speed. You can look at the aperture display to figure out which way to go. That's only if you're in aperture priority mode. If you are using a shutter speed that you select yourself, either for full manual, or if you set the aperture ring on your lens to the green A for the FDNs or the green circle for the FD lenses, then as soon as you take the shutter dial off of A, the meter display area on the right will display and the one on the bottom will disappear. It doesn't disappear. I mean, it's covered by a piece of black plastic. It's still there. You just can't see it. Anyway, if you're in full manual mode, as you can see the blue outline there, if you're in full manual mode, you'll see your shutter speed on the bottom, and then that vertical rectangle will display apertures. The aperture that you need will be indicated with a needle, and the aperture that you're set at will be indicated with a circle. So you just have to match the circle and the needle, and you'll know then that you have a proper exposure for your given shutter speed. If you adjust your shutter speed, then that needle will display and you'll have to adjust your aperture to move the circle. If you have your camera in shutter priority mode, meaning that the lens is in, so full manual, means you're controlling the shutter speed and the aperture setting yourself. Shutter priority means that you're controlling the shutter speed and that you have your FDN lens set to the green A or your FD lens set to the green circle, and then your camera is controlling the aperture based on the shutter speed that you select. In that case, what you'll see is no circle. The circle only displays in full manual mode, and just the aperture scale with the needle. So, at a glance, you can look through your viewfinder and tell which of the camera's modes you're in. If you see the display along the bottom, you know for a fact you're in aperture priority mode, that your shutter speed dial is set to A, and that the control you need to do is to adjust the aperture. If you see the display on the right and not along the bottom, then you know you're either in full manual mode or shutter priority mode. If you see a circle in the long vertical bar, then you know you're in full manual. If you don't see a circle, then you know you're in shutter priority. So that's one of the genius elements about this camera, is that it allows you to look through the viewfinder and see what mode you're in so that you can decide if you're in the correct mode, and if so, you can then use the features at your that are available to shoot correctly. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is how to take a double exposure. So let's talk about how to take an actual exposure. Now that you know how to meter it, now that you know the functions, let's take a picture. What you're going to do is you're going to hold it, or you're going to set it up on a tripod, whatever you're going to do, and you're going to look through the viewfinder in the back. You'll get your settings correct, your aperture, and your shutter speed if you're using manual mode, and you'll focus. Or you'll focus first, whatever works best for you, it's cool. All right, so now you've got your shot focused. Your settings are correct. You've previously, oh, come on. And you just take your picture. It's that simple. Advance your frame. There we go. And you're in good shape. All right, so that's how you take a picture. So let's talk about how to do a double exposure with this camera. We've seen how to do a standard exposure. The double exposure is going to include this R button. So the first thing we want to do is understand that a double exposure puts twice as much light onto your film, right? If you have a meter reading of f/5.6 at 1/125th of a second, we're going to go into manual for this because it's a little bit easier. At 1/125th, where is it? There it is. All right, so if this is what you're set up at, and this is a correct meter reading, you take a picture, you've taken a picture. There we go. If you want to do a double exposure, there are two ways to do it. You need to cut the amount of light in half for a double exposure on the same frame. You could either shoot at f8 for both exposures, or you could shoot at 1/250th. If you're using aperture priority mode, you would then adjust this guy over here to 1/2, because you want 1/2 of the light coming in for your double exposure. So the reason for that is that if you put two exposures onto the film, at full setting, you're going to have an overexposed image. But if you put two on it at half of the amount of light, you're going to have a single properly exposed double exposure, okay? That's, if you have a triple exposure, then you have to cut light even further. So now you've got your settings correct for your double exposure. You're going to take the first picture, you're going to push the R button and turn it. You have to push and turn. Advance. And now you're ready to go again. And you'll notice when you push the shutter button, this pops up. If you wanted to do a third exposure on that frame, you would push and turn and advance. And that's the process. Third frame, and now you advance. Oh my gosh, for real. Your camera should not just be doing this like mine does. Part of it is that when it's perfectly level, that seems to exacerbate the constant advance, 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 which indicates that there's a worn out or broken part inside of it. And when I hold it at basically any angle, it's fine. So another thing you can do if your camera is advance, advance, advance is try holding it at a different angle and see if that makes it magically work. So that's it. That is how you take double exposures with this camera. That's how you use this camera. We've gone over effectively everything there is to know about the F-1N, and the rest of it is just up to you. If this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track and that I'm producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you had any questions or comments or suggestions, please leave those in the comments section. I'm pretty good about checking those every day. If you have ideas, also recommend those. Just remember, as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So go out there, shoot as many photos as you can that are of good quality, that help you learn how to be a better photographer, and that help you advance your creative vision, because that is what this is all for. Yes, you can use this to document, to make a living, but there's a very good case to be made that the highest and best use for photography is for artistic expression. So go forth, and whether you do this for a living or not, enjoy the artistic freedom that having a good camera can give you. Thank you for watching.